Here's the big question that's been on my mind since the whole rave of HTMX and hypermedia is, from your point of view, at what point did we get it wrong that JSON was the holy grail?
Roy Fielding wrote his dissertation, which was about the web, and he described the
Mm-hmm.
web before JSON with like links and forms, and that's it. And
Yeah.
so REST was describing the web in that environment, like the old school web. And then what happened is that this Ajax thing came along from Microsoft. A lot of people forget that Microsoft invented Ajax. Um,
Oh.
and and so people started using, at the time they were called web services. They're not called that anymore, but back then they were called web services.
Hey there, everyone. Welcome to another Teach Kevin Your Thing session. This session, believe it or not, we've had to reschedule a couple of times and we persisted. And here we are having Carson Gross from HTMX, which is making all the waves. And I've invited him to come, let's first come teach Kelvin what is HTMX. And I have a ton of questions, but let's meet Carson. How you doing, Carson?
I'm doing pretty good. Definitely some technical difficulties. Last time it was me,
Mm-hmm.
and this time it's you. So, but I'm glad we stuck it out and got this thing going. So, be
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Thank you. Thank you so much. So you probably need no introduction because from the memes on Twitter to all from the books as well, the book,
Sure.
and from all your previous interviews. But let's meet you officially. So could you introduce yourself? Tell us who Carson Gross is, and most importantly, a fun fact about you. Do not leave out the fun fact.
So my name is Carson Gross. I teach at Montana State University. I live up in Bozeman, Montana, in the United States, and I created a front end library, kind of an alternative library called HTMX. It's pretty famous. I've got some other projects as well, but that HTMX is definitely the biggest. And wrote a book about it that your viewers can check out at
Mm-hmm.
hypermedia.systems, which is available online for free, or you can purchase it if you want. But yeah, I've just kind of become, an ambassador for Hypermedia, which is which is the technology that HTMX is based on. And I do have a Twitter account at HTMX_org that is very silly. I like making people laugh, and I like meme culture and all that stuff. So I'm old, as the gray in my beard suggests, but I feel like I punch pretty young with my Twitter account, or at least make a joke about being an old guy on Twitter. So one fun fact about me: I can throw a pretty good knuckleball. If you know American baseball, I can throw a pretty good
Yeah.
knuckleball. So
Oh wow. Fun
yeah.
fact. Growing up, one of my favorite animated movies was Everyone Heroes with Babe
Hmm.
Ruth as kind of like the storyline. Did you see it?
Yeah, I've never seen that movie.
Oh,
No.
yeah, it,
Yeah,
it
I'm
was
not.
very inspiring.
Yeah,
Yeah, like
yeah.
yeah,
Don't.
okay.
I don't watch enough movies, so but
Okay. Yeah,
I just saw
it's
them.
at this point it's very old at what
Yeah,
I think I was like 11 or 12 when I saw it, so it's really old.
yeah,
But it was really inspiring, and it was all about American baseball and this
yep,
young little batter. It was fun. But yeah,
yeah.
thank you for that fun fact. You brought back the baseball movie, which was fun. So you mentioned you are a professor.
Hmm.
Wow, that's interesting. So how long have you been one?
I've only been a professor now for 4 years. I
Okay.
was I lived in California. I'm a Californian. I'm not a native Montanan, so I moved up here about 5 years ago, and I had a startup in Sacramento, California, which is where I grew up and where I was
Mm-hmm.
living. And that startup kind of it didn't implode, but the co-founders and I got along, I feel like, with my co-founders fine, but I had two other co-founders, and they weren't able to get along with one another, and so
Mm.
they kind of they said, look, we got to sell this thing, and that was a pretty big bummer for me. I just was like, I'm
Oh,
not, I didn't want to do that,
yeah.
but it's also, you can't make people be together if they don't want to be together. So I just kind
True.
of was like, well, if we're going to do this, let's go big and make a big life change. And I'd been coming out to Montana a whole bunch
Mm-hmm.
with my family and really liked it. It's very cold, but it's very beautiful. Lots of good skiing and so forth. And I was just like, I need something totally different. And so just almost like on a lark, I applied to be a professor here at Montana State, thinking there's no way they'd accept me. But they did, and they offered me a
They
job. And I
did.
was like, I looked at my wife and was like, "Well, what do you think? Can you do Montana?" And she was hesitant, but we did it, and so now been doing it for about
Mm-hmm.
4 years. I've taught a total of 4 years. We're moving into our 5th year here, and it's been good. It's challenging. They say you learn stuff a lot better when you teach it. So I feel like
Mm-hmm.
I've got a much better handle on a lot of stuff now that I've taught it. It's just like writing that Hypermedia book taught me a lot more about Hypermedia. So
Of
there's
course.
something to that. So it's been good for me.
Mm.
We'll see how long there are downsides to university life. You do get summers off, which is nice.
Mm-hmm.
But there are downsides too. The pay isn't great, and there's a lot of bureaucracy to deal with and so forth. So, but right
Mm.
now I'm happy doing that. And HTMX keeps me busy. HTMX and youth baseball keep me busy when I'm not doing that stuff. So,
Nice. That's amazing. That's really
yeah,
awesome. So, what are you teaching at Montana?
yeah. I teach. So I teach what's called systems, which is basically a survey of computing, kind of like from
Okay.
transistors up. And then,
Mm-hmm.
so start with transistors and like, here's how an adder works, and here's how machine code works, and here's how assembly works, and here's how you translate assembly into machine code. And then here's how you write a higher level compiler like C and translate that into assembly. And then here's how, like a virtual machine, we look at the JVM. So it's kind of a survey of computing class. That's actually been the best class for me because I learned a ton in putting the class together.
Mm-hmm.
And then I teach the compilers class, which I've always liked. When I went to graduate school, I did it in programming languages. So I've always
Mm-hmm.
liked compilers, and I found out about recursive descent parsing after graduate school, and I was kind of infuriated how easy writing a compiler is if you don't use these really obscure tools like Lex and Yak. And so I always was like, if I ever teach compilers, I'm going to teach recursive descent. And so
Yeah.
I teach a class around that. And then I teach a database class, which is more how to use databases than how to build
Mm-hmm.
databases. So it's focused mainly on SQL and so forth. And then I'm finally
Nice.
this semester, I'm going to teach an advanced web development, which is going to be sort of
Oh,
hypermedia oriented. So based on HTMX in my
yes.
book. So
Mm.
I'm hopeful I might be able to put it up online. So
Ooh.
maybe I can. So hopefully I'll be able. I think the university is going to let me do it. So I'll be able to just put the whole thing online.
Yeah, that would be fun to watch. Yeah, thank you for sharing all that.
Yeah.
Really. So, I'm trying to grok a couple of things here because you do
Yep.
sound like a systems engineering nerd.
Yeah.
Like in compiling and stuff.
Hmm.
How how does that work with you giving us something as HTMX and understanding hypermedia, and really using it the proper way? Because in fact, before you answer all of that,
Hmm.
maybe after you answer that, no, because I think this one come before that. Like, how do you correlate being a systems nerd and working on HTMX, which is this more on a web dev side of things? Like, how do you pass that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think like, the way I look at it is, well, I just did web development for a long time,
Okay.
that's just what I did. And I found this like particular way of doing web development that I liked. And so I just sort of uh, built that library out. But I always, I wouldn't say I was a systems guy. Well, I don't know. I was kind of a systems guy in graduate school. I liked compilers and programming languages, like the practical aspects of them, and so that's systems to an extent. But you know, I made Hyperscript, which is a programming language for the web, for doing web development too. And so I just kind of like a lot of different things like that. My systems level chops, like I don't particularly like C very much. Like, I don't like the style of programming that C encourages and so forth. And so I wouldn't say I'm like a low level guy. I like web development. I like garbage collected programming languages and so forth, like, unless there's a real need to avoid them. And
Sure.
so, I don't know. I don't want to present myself as like some like super low level hacker. I've got a, pretty good idea of how computers work at a low level,
Yeah.
just because I teach some of that stuff. What do I want to say? Like,
Mm,
at a high level, I understand how low level stuff works. I guess is probably the way I'd say it.
mm,
But I'm definitely not like an
yes.
embedded programmer or something like that. So, and web
Yeah.
development's just what I've done for a long time. So,
Yeah, awesome. So let's I really like your origin story. So you say you've done web development for a long time. Do you want to walk us, summarize, I don't know how many decades of your life in a couple of
yeah,
minutes, and like how you got
yeah,
started with web dev to those
hmm
points of
yeah.
HTMX?
And it's ironic. So I started doing web programming back in like the late '90s using CGI bin stuff, and just like the
Mm-hmm.
real old school web development back when browsers were very non-standardized and so forth. And I
Yeah.
actually in around 2002, I stopped doing web development because I just didn't like how chaotic the tools were. There was a lot of there were incompatibilities, and JavaScript was very new and very bad as a programming language. And so I ended up doing, for like 2 or 3 years, I ended up using a technology called Java Web Start, which was a way to launch a Java thick application kind of over the network. And so I did a lot of like RPC style programming with like thick applications, which are in some ways very similar to what SPAs, like what modern JavaScript based SPAs look like. Primitive in some ways, but very like similar in other ways. Java Swing has things like reactive components, and like it has all that stuff in it in a proper UI toolkit. And so I just was like, this is like real programming. Web programming is for kids, and like this is real. And then I ended up, after graduate school, I ended up going to a company, and they were building a web app. And so I was like, well, I guess I'm doing web apps again. And so I ended up doing web apps and like getting into that. And then after I left that company and moved back to Sacramento, that was all down in the Bay Area. Um, I started a company that was based on Ruby on Rails. That was the company that we had to sell about 5 years ago. And so then, Rails, I always had admired Rails from a distance, but yeah, I finally got to like really get into it. And Rails is very internet. What do I want to say? Web oriented. It's very webby. It's like they take the ideas of the web and just make them easy and obvious, and like really you build a web app in Rails in a way that you don't in some other frameworks. And so that really got me into web development and understanding like what HTTP was trying to do and all this stuff. And when I was doing that, that's when I built a library called Intercooler.js, this was back in 2013, and that was the predecessor to HTMX. It was based on jQuery, and so it used jQuery internally to do stuff. And so HTMX is basically a rewrite of that library, but without jQuery dependency, because JavaScript has come so far, and so you don't need jQuery to do a lot of stuff now. So that's kind of, and I was doing web programming pretty much the whole time. I've done less actually in the last couple of years just because I'm teaching so much. So that's, I feel like I kind of grew up a little bit with the early web, and then kind of walked away from it for a little bit, and then came back to it in sort of the Java enterprise world where the web isn't as emphasized. It's more, it's more architect. There's more architecture there. And then finally, like Rails really drove home like how the web was quote unquote supposed to work. And then when I made Intercooler, people were like, "Oh, this is super RESTful." Like, and I was like, "What do you mean? RESTful's JSON." And so it took me a long time to like figure all that stuff out and understand the conversations that I hadn't understood when I was younger, and people were arguing about things like that. So kind of a twisting path, but here we are. And now I'm the hypermedia guy.
Now you're the Hypermedia guy and the
Yeah.
memes guy on
And a
X.
memes guy. I've always been a memes guy.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's
So,
fun. I think in one way or the other, Reels has influenced, or we've all had met Reels at one point in time, or Reels met us, because sales, which I use heavily, was also inspired by Reels and all that. So uh, the other question I was getting to, because I love how you've mentioned your journey, from building with CGI, adapting jQuery, building intercooler, making jQuery dependencies, and then removing it and then renaming or learning more stuff and becoming more hypermedia driven to HTMX. So here's the big question that's been on my mind since the whole rave of HTMX and hypermedia is, from your point of view, at what point did we get it wrong that JSON was the holy grail? Because
mm,
I have come across Roy Fielding's dissertation a
mm-hmm.
number of times across my career, and I had the assumption that he was talking about the REST API we have today, which is all JSON spitting REST API. And it was when I started looking at HTMX and your, hypermedia, and I go back, he wasn't talking about JSON.
No.
How were we parroting JSON all these years? Where did we miss it?
Yeah,
What happened?
I wrote an essay about it. If you go to htmx.org/essays, there's a "How did
Mhm.
REST come to me in the opposite of a REST" essay, and that kind of lays out the history of it. It's a little complicated, but the short story is basically Roy Fielding wrote his dissertation, which was about the web, and he described the
Mhm.
web before JSON with like links and forms, and that's it. And
Yeah.
so REST was describing the web in that environment, like the old school web. And then what happened is that this Ajax thing came along from Microsoft. A lot of people forget that Microsoft invented Ajax.
Oh.
And they and so people started using, at the time they were called web services. They're not called that anymore, but back then they were called web services, and people were using web services in XML. So XML was the format that was
Yeah.
typically used because it looked a lot like
Mhm.
HTML, and the enterprise world was very familiar with it and so forth. And as they were doing that, there was this standard called SOAP, and a lot of people
Yeah.
haven't heard of SOAP today, but SOAP was
Of
this
course.
really heavyweight XML, like RPC proto. It was crazy. And it was very enterprisey and heavyweight and just like lots of code generation and all sorts of stuff. And people were using it and for these web services. And then JSON came out and people started looking at JSON and saying, oh, JSON's like very lightweight and it's easy to understand and you can look at it and understand what's going on and it's way better than this SOAP stuff. And at that same time, people had they were talking about REST and about like, oh, Roy Fielding, when he talked about the web, he talked about REST. And so maybe we can do web services in a RESTful way. And so they started doing that. And there's a somewhat famous essay called the Richardson Maturity Hierarchy, which was put out by ThoughtWorks. Is it ThoughtWorks? It's but basically it's this essay that sort of talks about like the levels of maturity of an API and trying to become more and more RESTful. And so boy, this isn't a very short story, but basically what happened was
Go on,
this.
please.
SOAP failed because it was too
Yeah.
complicated. It collapsed under its own complexity. And so JSON won. And the opposite of SOAP was REST. Not because like that was true conceptually, but because it was true mimetically. Like there wasn't they didn't have a word for what JSON APIs were that in opposition to SOAP. And so this
Yeah.
REST term kind of got grafted onto that. It's not SOAP, so it's REST, right? Sure, okay. And it kind of looks like REST. They use sort of RESTful layout of URLs and so forth. So it's resource oriented in that regard. But it never really got at the heart of REST, which is the uniform interface, which is really what makes REST special in my mind, is this thing called the uniform interface, where a server response carries along the entire UI that's required, or that all the information that's necessary to interact with that resource is encoded in the response or implied by the response, is what Fielding would say. And so it just was this sort of bad luck, wrong place, wrong time, where REST was like the opposite of SOAP. And so whatever wasn't SOAP was REST. And so now we have JSON APIs, which are not RESTful because they don't contain what are called hypermedia controls. They don't have links and forms in them. Even when they do, that's not enough to make a system RESTful, but that's a long conversation. But so that's sort of what happened. It was just, people just got the language wrong. I think it's changing a little bit. People are now just saying JSON API, which is fine, or like data API or whatever. But it also kind of doesn't matter. So, it's just language. It's language. I think it's more important to understand the uniform interface than it is to, be really pedantic about using the term REST properly. Like, because the uniform interface is what's interesting technically in my mind, or it's the most interesting thing about REST. And most JSON APIs don't satisfy it. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I feel like that was much longer than I wanted it to be.
No. Trust me, I am an history geek. I love this.
Yeah.
In fact, I wouldn't want you to stop. But I think it makes a lot of sense now because Phil Sturgeon, he wrote a book called APIs You Won't Hate. And we've spoken a couple of times, and you mentioned that most REST APIs are not RESTful because of a lot of things that are not there. And I haven't been able to parse what that means. So every time I go back to the Roy Fielding's dissertation, there are a lot of parts that I don't see in the JSON REST API these days.
Yeah.
And how it makes a lot of sense because he wasn't talking about APIs. It makes a lot of sense right now because he was talking about web pages and how to have to use hypermedia and all that good stuff. It makes perfect sense right now. So I think
I would say
they have to, go on.
One thing I would say there is it is an API. It's just it's a REST API, which is different.
Yeah.
It's not a data. We think of it when we say API, we mean data API. Like that's what you and I, when in casual conversation, you're like, oh, my API does this or that. It's like we mean data APIs. But HTML is like, it's an API. It's an application programming interface.
Yeah, for sure.
Designed to be consumed by a RESTful client, a browser, or whatever. And so, but then that's another thing that, like, again, I don't know how deep you want to go into this, but like, I struggle to communicate to people at times that, like, it's not enough to just add like some @link things in your JSON API and call it RESTful. Like, you need, in order to do the uniform interface, which again, I keep saying that, but let me just give you a quick brief overview of what the uniform interface is. Basically, like, what's special about a web page is when a web browser downloads it, all the interactions with that resource that it just downloaded are encoded in the actual UI, and I don't want to say in the UI, they're in the data. And so, like, you have links, all the links and all the forms and all the stuff you can do with that thing are there inside it. And the web browser doesn't know what that thing is. It doesn't know I'm looking at a web page about a car or a dog or a grocery bag or whatever. It just knows this is HTML and there's some links and forms in it and I can render that. And so that makes the browser extremely flexible because it has this uniform interface. This HTML is this uniform way to, like, consume whatever resource you can give to it and present actions for those. And that's in contrast with like a raw data API, where, like, if you just get back like a dog, or let's say a car JSON packet, like, you have to know, like, where can I go to, like, rent the car or buy the car or return the car or what. Like, you have to know all that stuff. You have to know how to work with that data. You have to know what a car is. You have to be able to render it to a UI, run it through some template. Like, you as a consumer, as the client consuming that code, have to understand it at a much deeper level. And so the browser and these clients that are designed to consume hypermedia, browsers being the most famous, they're crucial to that whole thing working. And so this is one reason why you can't just slap links in a JSON API and have a RESTful system. You can argue about whether or not the API is RESTful, but the client that's consuming it, unless it's consuming it in a way that's uniform, then it's, if you're consuming a JSON API that has @links in it for, like, the next page, that's a common thing to do with it. And you have hard-coded code that looks for like the next page URL, like you're not, that's not a uniform interface, because you're just hard coding stuff, you know. Like you might as well download the HTML and like parse it and pull out the links. Like as a client, like you're not satisfying the uniform interface on the client side. And so I don't know, it's that's maybe a little too nerdy, but that's really the big distinction. That's like Hypermedia is a system. That's why we called our book Hypermedia Systems, because you have to have both the client and the server and the protocol and all this stuff working together in order to get this uniform interface property out of the system. So
Yeah. Wow. That's a lot. That is some
yeah, sorry.
unlearning to do. Yeah, that's definitely gonna I have to, so I plan on getting a physical copy of the book because I don't like reading books
Mm,
online. I
sure.
like paper. So I'm gonna go
Yeah.
get it and also read your dissertation, your essays. So
Mm,
one cool thing you've mentioned, and I think if we've gotten Roy Fielding's REST dissertation wrong, then a
mm,
couple of folks might not understand what you mean when you say hypermedia. Do you want to take
mm.
us to school on that one? Just like maybe
Yeah.
primer?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hyper. What is hypermedia?
Yeah.
So hypermedia is a media, so some sort of text or video or whatever, some sort of video that contains nonlinear branching functionality within the media. And so
Mm-hmm.
what that means is it has, like, just the canonical example is the link, right? Like you can click on a
Mm-hmm.
link and go somewhere else. And so
Mm-hmm.
originally hypermedia was contrasted with sort of old media like books, right? Where, you know, you kind of read it in a linear fashion. And so what made it
Mm-hmm.
hypermedia is this ability to jump around. And then what Fielding kind of, I think, got at in his dissertation was that particularly when form tags were added to HTML, so HTML had links, and then in HTML2 they added these form things. What he was getting at was, we've got this new thing now, this what hypermedia is, and he didn't say this, and I kind of wish he had. He actually never uses the term hypermedia control,
Mm-hmm.
but that I think is like one of the key concepts to understanding what hypermedia is. And so hypermedia control is an element that is in the data that specifies or implies, he would say, but I would just say specifies, that specifies an interaction with that current representation. So you get back a web page, it's got links and forms in it. Those links and those forms allow you to interact with that, with whatever that thing is representing, right? And so you've got these things called hypermedia controls, which are links and forms in the media, and they're present in the media. Like they're, and Fielding does say this. He talks about, he calls them control elements, I think. But
Mm-hmm.
these, the idea of being able to actually include the actions along with the presentation information. Like, and in my mind, that's like the deep meaning of hypermedia. Like a hypermedia is a media that includes interactivity in it, like and network interactivity, not just local like hide show stuff, but like the ability to continue to interact with this remote system. Like, what I would say, the definition I would give for hypermedia is a media of some sort that has hypermedia controls in it, which are elements within the presentation information that specify remote interactions. At least that's what I would say distributed hypermedia is.
That's amazing. So there was something you mentioned, which I think it's a good segue to my next line of question.
Mm,
Is distributed, right? Because I
mm,
also wrote, because I have this side thing I do, not a side, it's shipless JavaScript. It's a whole domain and it's a whole thing of what I do, which is trying to encourage more people in the way we build apps to ship less JavaScript. And I wrote the first article there is called It's Client Server, Not Client or Server, because I believe the web is architected in, it's a distributed system of a client and a server. But I sort of term two set of factions, which is that the server purists just want to do everything on the server, don't like JavaScript, hate it, don't touch it. And then the client enthusiasts, we heavy React, very heavy SPA, like where we just go there. But I believe like the best web experience is one who embraces this client server architecture, this distributed nature of how web systems are meant to be, right? So that was one of the reasons why I liked when I saw HTMX come out. I'm like, okay, this is really cool. That means, for one to use HTMX, that means you have a proper, server. You have a server delivering, the content, and then HTMX just come and do the things for interactivity, fetching stuff, and all that kind of jazz. So that really makes a lot of sense. Do you really see was that the type of application which was client heavy? Was that the kind of thing you saw that sort of like made you uninterested with the way folks build web apps with JavaScript?
Um, it's funny. I never really worked too much with like heavy SPA libraries
Mm-hmm.
because I built intercooler pretty early, and so
Yeah.
um, I was just outside that world, and I kind of tried to communicate with people and say, "Hey, there's this other way," but I wasn't. I've gotten much better at online discourse and understanding the psychology of communication and so forth as I've gotten older, and so I didn't do a good
Yeah.
job. I was very sarcastic and, to be honest, like a little nasty at times to people. And as I've gotten older, I've just gotten better at like, okay, like we're all just trying to figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
So I just can't say it was like I was looking at this and had a deep understanding of what was going on in React, or Angular was the big one when Intercooler first came
Yeah.
out. But I'd worked previously at the company I worked at right before I started working on Intercooler, and they had used a library called XJS. I don't know if you've ever heard of that library. It's a
No, should be.
really it's yeah it was I think it's
Should,
commercial now. It's not open source.
oh, okay.
Um,
Yeah.
but it was a really heavy JavaScript framework, and that experience left a very sour taste in my mouth. And so I just was like, I'm not doing this. I don't care if I'm unhirable or whatever. Like
Mm-hmm.
I'm not doing that. And so I can't say it was like particularly rational on my part. It was just
Mm-hmm.
more a feeling of like, I'm just going to do it this way. And I had always been comfortable with like server side templating, particularly once I got into Rails and like saw how clean ERB
Mm-hmm.
files were and so forth. I was like, I'm just going to do
Yeah.
this all on the server side. So I
Mm.
can't, I've said this before, like I'm not in a good position to criticize React. And I don't feel like you have to criticize React
Yeah,
to
for
be an
sure.
HTML. You don't have to
Mm-hmm.
criticize React to be an HTMX fan. It's a tool. Hypermedia is a tool. And,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's appropriate and sometimes it's not. I think it's appropriate for a lot of stuff that's being built in React. And I think we have some
Mm-hmm.
evidence for that now, that it can be very effective for some of the same
Mm-hmm.
applications, but there's obviously stuff that it's not right for. And so, you can pick the right tool for the job. I've tried to de-escalate I do, like, I have fun on Twitter and like,
I
post
know,
all
I
sorts of
know.
crazy stuff on Twitter. But at the end of the
I
day,
know.
like, we're all trying to build web apps. So it's all good.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So I have a theory, right? Which is,
Mm,
before Node, right? Everyone who was using JavaScript was using it on the client, right? Like
yeah.
most people, we're building interactions, and then Gmail came out with the whole SPA thing and stuff. So
Yep.
even now that we have Node, it's sort of like a little bit hard to leverage doing work on the server and
Mm,
just sprinkle JS on the client, because we are client side first, folks, who is now
mm-hmm,
trying to learn how to do stuff on the server. But if you come
mm-hmm,
from things like Rails and Laravel, you've been server side folk, and then you know how to sprinkle, just like things with Finis Live View and Laravel Livewire and even Hotwire from Rails. These are
mm-hmm,
server side first, folks. All right. So I think we are a little bit, I wouldn't say disadvantage, but we would always, most of the time, tend to lean towards doing stuff on the client, because that's what the world we were in
mm-hmm,
before we were shown Node. Like Node is relatively younger than JavaScript, and these are
mm-hmm.
folks that have been doing it to the clients for like forever. So it's going to
Yeah.
really take a lot of unlearning to start, shifting the work. Even with things like RSC, I like the idea in theory, but it's a little bit confusing with a lot of things going on. But it's still going to take this confusion because why? We are client side folks. Like JavaScript was born on the client. Now trying to
Yeah.
understand how to work server, it's going to take a lot of work. So folks that started
Yeah.
server first sort of like have an advantage because we know that we've always been sprinkling stuff with JavaScript here and there. JavaScript was not the center of our story. It was mostly just
Yeah.
like in the assets folder where we bundle, some of the jQuery thing here and there. So I think that's the thing we have here with the SPA folks is that I don't know that impediment or a little disadvantage of starting client first.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, I understand where you're coming from, but I think it might be a
Hmm.
little bit of the grass is always greener too, because in
Yeah.
my opinion, if you can figure out a GraphQL API, you can figure
Hmm.
out SQL. And if you can figure out SQL, then now you're cooking with gas on the server side because you can do whatever you
Yeah.
want. You have JSX is available on the server side. Template languages are pretty
Hmm.
standardized. There's some different features, but it's just not that hard at the end of the
Yeah.
day. And what front end developers often have, which is a huge advantage over back end developers, is a good knowledge of JavaScript where it's necessary, good
Yeah.
knowledge of working knowledge of HTML, hopefully, and then in particular, I think a good knowledge of CSS. Like CSS is
Yeah.
hard. Like CSS is
Yeah.
really, really
That is
hard.
true.
It is one of the hardest
That's.
things I think it's one of the hardest things in computer science because it's so
Hmm.
complicated the way the layout model works, and just like where do you
Hmm.
even begin to achieve things. And so the front end developers who are coming in and maybe taking a look at HTMX, yeah, you might have to learn a backend framework, but there's lots of good JavaScript backend frameworks now. You got Bun and Hano and like just all sorts of stuff that's should be very
Yeah.
comfortable
Sales
for
too.
your average JavaScript developer to pick up. And then just
Hmm.
having the ability, that understanding of how HTML and JavaScript and CSS all fit together to achieve
Hmm.
things, as long as you're willing to be a little flexible and kind of get your head around how hypermedia works. I think
Hmm.
that front end developers are set up really well, I should say, to take advantage of HTMX where it's an appropriate technology. I know it's a little scary, but
Hmm.
the server side is great.
Yeah.
What's great about the server side? You get everything you want. Like you don't have to ask someone for a new API. You just
Hmm.
hit the database, and if it's too slow,
Hmm.
you tune the database query. And no one's going
Hmm.
to tell you you've got to wait 2 weeks to get your new updated API or push back on it and say, no, you can't have that because it's too specialized for your UI. Like you don't get that. It's just like, I want to do the thing I want to do. And learning SQL, I would rather learn SQL than CSS. I'll say that. Like SQL is not that bad. there's like 5 or 6 things that matter in it. And
Yeah.
then like, yeah, you figure out how indexes work and all that stuff, like whatever. But
Yeah. And
CSS is a lot. And so I think there's a grass is greener there where it's like, yeah, you don't understand some of the stuff on the server side, but the server side guys don't understand how to build a decent looking UI. And
hmm
so that's a big deal too. So I think there's
yeah.
going to be some very, very effective HTMX developers that were that were like more front end developers who just kind of get comfortable with the server side.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Like, even with the SQL thing, you don't really have to write raw SQL. Even there are
Mm.
ORMs in these backend frameworks already that makes your life
Yeah.
simple. But it's just fall back to the old thing because I've been pushing this like for like a while. Is that when you're getting started with web dev, it would do you a lot of good to just embrace it as holistic and just learn web dev and not
Mm-hmm.
just choose okay, I'm a front end developer, I'm a back end developer, and front-end
Yeah.
devs are very scared of SQL. They're very scared of setting up a database and all that jazz. It will just do you a lot of good because there's a beauty in understanding how these things work as a whole than just
Mm.
send me throw JSON over the fence and I would pass it and create my UI. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the way to look at it. So yeah, let's get into HTMX really quickly.
Yep.
Let's talk about it conceptually because on
Mm-hmm.
first glance at HTML, without thinking about hypermedia, let's skip it. It looks something like Alpine,
Mm-hmm.
right? So which just give you things to do some interaction, but you are making some fetch and some posts in there with all directives. What
Mm-hmm.
inspired that API really? Like just, not having to be imperative but declarative.
Yeah. It just seemed like the natural thing to me. I can't say there was PJAX, which was a
Mm-hmm.
JavaScript library that it was basically like I looked at PJAX and jQuery had something called fetch. I forget what it was called, but jQuery had this
Sure.
thing too where you could just say, here's a URL and then put the result into this element. And so I
Okay.
saw that, and I saw PJAX, which was big in Rails, the Rails world when I first got
Mm-hmm.
into it. And then I saw how Angular used attributes, and I just kind of took those three things and was like, well,
Mm.
okay, like what do I really want to do here? I want to make a post, and then I want to take the result and I want to put it somewhere. And then I thought about it a little bit more and was like, and really the event, like the click or whatever, like that can be general too. So, like
Mm-hmm.
if something scrolls into view or whatever. So it was just, it was pretty organic and just me thinking about like, okay, what are the generic components of, and at the time I had no, when I created Intercooler, I had like no understanding of hypermedia. What I say
Mm.
now is like, oh, HTMX generalizes that idea of hypermedia controls that we talked about earlier, where it's like, okay,
Yeah, sure.
what is a hypermedia control? A hypermedia control is a thing in the UI that drives a remote request in response to some event and then takes the hypermedia response and places it somewhere on the screen,
Mm-hmm.
either like the entire viewport or in the case of HTMX in some chunk, or you can, I don't know if you've ever seen this before, but you can have links that actually target iframes. If you use iframes in traditional web applications, you can
Mm-hmm.
actually like click on a link and have it target an iframe. And so
Mm.
HTMX is sort of a generalization of that, so you don't have to use iframes. So that's the API grew organically, and just me thinking like, I don't know, this is kind of how I want it to work. And then I sort of backed into a more conceptual, like a more theoretical understanding of it once I
Mm-hmm.
had built it, which is not uncommon. It's very often that like the engineering precedes the philosophy. Like that's how
Mm-hmm.
things often work. Like you kind of do the thing and then step back and like, okay, what did I just do?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. And so I've noticed something from just checking out HTMX. It doesn't have any dependencies, right? So that
yeah.
means so at the so let's just say at a high level, when you're using HTMX, what categories of work is HTMX doing for like a full web app application? Because first of all, we've already established that you need a server side app, so that means you're a
Mm-hmm.
complete. You're building a full stack app. So
Mm-hmm.
what categories of work is being done by HTMX at a high level?
Yeah.
Yeah.
HTMX, what it's good at is
Mm-hmm.
driving server interactions, right?
Oh,
The
cool.
idea with HTMX is there's a server interaction with some resource. This is like the idea of REST. There's a server
Mm-hmm.
interaction with some resource, and that is going to update the representation of that resource in some way, and then we need to display that. And the old school way of doing that is you have links or more commonly forms, and you click submit
Mm-hmm.
and it updates the thing and then re-renders the whole page. And what HTMX just does is basically breaks that down so it can be finer grained. So you can say, okay,
Okay.
when you click this button, go and do something on the server side and then take the representation, which might be full or partial representation, and then place it somewhere in the screen to indicate that the state has been updated. And so it's taking that old web way of thinking about things of like
Mm-hmm.
hypermedia controls and then making it more flexible basically so you can achieve more UI, so you can do cooler UI with that same idea. So it's really focused again on that conceptual idea of like, I've got a resource that I'm viewing in a uniform manner. I've got
Yeah.
a browser that's consuming this uniform interface of HTML. And within that HTML are the hypermedia controls that tell me what I can do with this resource. And when I interact with those controls, then it triggers a remote request, which updates something and then displays the updated state of the resource in some way.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what it's good at. What it's not good at is stuff like, for example, toggling a class to like hide and show something that's like purely client side, right? Or selecting
Okay.
something that maybe there's another panel and you want that select and show something
Mm-hmm.
in that panel to all be local, to not make a network request. That's one of the downsides downsides of distributed hypermedia in any event is that it's always making a remote request when you have some sort of interaction. And so people often say like, oh, this is dumb. Like you got to, like every click has to go to the server, and that's true in some sense, but it's not true
Mhm.
in that HTMX isn't trying to solve that problem. Like that's if you want to do that, that's fine, but HTMX isn't the tool for that problem. You can
Okay.
have, for example, detail elements. That's a native element in HTML that you can click on to expand and collapse
Yeah.
something, or you can do client-side scripting of some sort. Like that's what Hyperscript, which is a scripting language I work on, is for that kind of stuff. And HTMX doesn't try to solve that. It's just that's not what it's for. It's the academic language I would use is I would say HTMX abstracts hypermedia controls in HTML. It provides general hypermedia controls in HTML. It's
Mhm.
for distributed interactions and updating hypermedia representations, and that's what it's for. And so in as much as you're trying to do something else, then it's probably not good for that. But there are other good tools that you can pair with HTMX, like Alpine JS is a good example, that can be used for that stuff. Or some people use jQuery with HTMX is fine. Like whatever you want to do, React, like whatever it is, but HTMX is there to provide the hypermedia based interactions with the server.
Mhm. Okay. So yeah, so just to paint a quick, contrast with the world I'm currently in, which is,
Mm-hmm.
so I sort of embrace this client server with sales and maybe view on the client.
Mm-hmm.
So I built this thing called a boring JavaScript stack using something called inertia from the
Mm-hmm.
Laravel world. So I want to paint a contrast. In
Mm-hmm.
my world of SPAs, how
Mm-hmm.
would you say we've been doing this abstraction of hypermedia controls? I'm thinking fetch, is
Mm-hmm.
it? All right, like, yeah, go on.
I would say there aren't hypermedia controls there, because
Okay.
what you're doing is you're writing a thick client app. You're doing it in a browser,
Mm-hmm.
which is a testament to
Yeah.
how amazing browsers are. You're interacting with a data API, and then you're
Mm-hmm.
reactively updating the UI, and that's fine. Like that is a perfectly acceptable architecture. Like it has a long history, and like it's all good. And there's lots of good tools for it. But that's not hypermedia. That's not the hypermedia approach to doing things. Unless without getting into the details, like for the most part, people who are programming in that manner aren't using hypermedia. So hypermedia is just like again, it's just a tool. It's just a different way of doing things with advantages and disadvantages to it. And so I think like there's nothing wrong with that approach. Like and working with a data API that your client has a strong understanding of what it is, and you're doing reactive updates to the UI and all that sort of stuff. That's fine. It's all good. It's just that's not
Yeah.
hypermedia, and but it's
Yeah.
been used. I would call that. I don't know if it's the standard. I think WordPress is still like 60% or 70% of the internet. So like, I don't know if there's a standard architecture, but I would say that's a very popular architecture for web applications, and it's used
Yeah.
successfully by loads of teams. So I don't want
Mm-hmm.
to. When I say, "Oh, that's not hypermedia," it's like that's not an
No,
insult.
it's
That's just it's a
definitely
category.
it's yeah, it's so good. So even in this data-driven category,
Mm-hmm.
um, the I think probably the way inertia does it might be interesting to you. I don't even think it's hypermedia, but it doesn't really send data. It's sort of like it encodes a couple of data that the HTML would need and knows
Mm-hmm.
how to swap them. So your routing is on the server. So you're using something like Laravel on the server. So when I
Mm-hmm.
click on a link, it's not really getting JSON and everything. It's more
Okay.
like getting back a full page, but it's going
Okay.
to tell from the server, because we're using a lot of HTTP headers and stuff, to say like,
Yeah.
okay, this is an initial request. It's not a
Yeah.
full page. Reload, send it by
Yep.
Ajax, swap the component, and give the data the component need as prop.
Okay.
It is just this other approach, which is weird, but it
Yeah.
really makes sense because it makes you not to need a data API, because you're
Yeah.
just loading the data the page needs with the page. It just
Yeah.
on the side. It's interesting to me.
Yeah, it sounds it's like maybe, and I don't understand it very well, but it might be similar
Mm-hmm.
to like Laravel Live View and to what is it, Phoenix? Was it Phoenix? What's the
Yeah,
Phoenix
so
one?
it's Phoenix Live View, then
Phoenix Live
Laravel
View and
Live
Laravel
Wire.
Live
Yeah,
Wire, right?
yeah, yeah.
And so those
Mm-hmm.
those my understanding, again, I don't know the details too much of them, but my understanding is what those do is they compute a delta on the server and then stream down the delta, and then that
Mm-hmm.
delta gets stitched into the UI, which is really really nice in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What that does do, however, is it requires a really tight server and client coupling, in that like you have
Mm-hmm.
to have like a fair amount of intelligence on both sides of the wire to understand, how that's all going to work. And like the server side, again, this is my outsider maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but the server
Yeah,
side has to
sure.
know what the client side looks like in order to stream down the minimal deltas, right? Like they're coupled in some sense. And so HTMX is very agnostic towards the server side, and that's a
Mm-hmm.
disadvantage in some ways, because it's you can't do this fancy stuff where like you can figure out like the absolute minimum to send down and automatically figure out what to update and all that stuff. So it's that's a disadvantage in that regard, but it's an advantage in that your client and your server are they're more decoupled. Like HTMX isn't relying on a server behaving in a certain way. It's just the server returns HTML and it puts it into the UI wherever you tell it to. And so
Mm-hmm.
there's an advantage to that simplicity as well, and that like again, it depends a huge amount on like what your team structure is and what's important to you and all the rest of it. But I think
Mm.
there's just like every other engineering approach possible, there's trade-offs, and so
Yeah, for sure.
HTMX really stays agnostic towards the server side and just says, hey, whatever you give me, I'm going to put it wherever you tell me to put it, and that's it, and that's all I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to do. So that's what
Yeah,
HTMX is, and I don't anticipate that changing.
yeah, for sure. That makes a lot of sense. So, um, the inertial approach is sort of like what in the Laravel world is the alternative to using Livewire. So I sent you an
Mm-hmm.
email with like the how it works page, because I really
Okay,
like your thoughts on that particular way. But let's leave that aside. I want to see HTMX in action with the
okay,
yeah, because this is the thing. Like, I want to see how you use it. Your thought process
sure,
on how you build this stuff. So yeah, let's
yeah,
get into the code and see HTMX,
okay,
because I have a friend who is a big user of HTMX. So
mm,
he builds API toolkit. I don't know if you know it. And
yeah,
he
yeah,
uses
yeah,
HTMX a ton. And he always
mm,
speaks highly. Like, is you gotta
yeah.
check this out. So I want to see how, like, what's he talking about? Let's say
Sure.
it.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm probably going to disappoint you in my demo, but you want me to share
It's,
my screen?
yeah, please do. Don't worry.
Okay,
I'm
let's
not gonna
share.
be disappointed.
All right, so um, I'm going to, where do I want to be here? And here we go. We're going to be looking at a to-do app, which is kind of a joke because a lot of people say, oh, HTMX, all you can do is to-do apps in it. um, but this is a to-do app, and it's even worse. It's written in Java, which I know a lot of people hate, but I don't mind Java, so I kind of like it. So it's what
Okay.
I do a lot of my classes in Java, so it's just like what I got in front of me. But I'm
Nice.
gonna do it in Java, and I'm gonna use a couple of tools. One called Javelin, and then one called JTE. Jeet, I don't
Mm-hmm.
know. It's a templating language. And so
Okay.
let me just walk you really quickly through the code base so you can see what's going on here. Let me restart this. Stop and rerun this. I use IntelliJ. I use the JetBrains tools. So I apologize to all the NeoVim users. But basically, we're going to have an in-memory linked hash map. This is just an ordered hash map. It keeps things in orders in Java of like IDs to do objects. I'm also ashamed to admit I like object-oriented programming. And so we've got a to-do object
That's
here,
good.
which has got an ID, a string, and whether or not it's
Okay.
completed, and then some methods for whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I like object-oriented programming. People don't, but I do. And so
Yeah,
we create a
that's
couple
fine.
to-dos and we put them into our data store. This should be capitalized, but whatever, it's all good. And then this
Mm-hmm.
is Javelin, which is like a very lightweight web server way a lightweight way to start a web server and map it to paths.
Okay.
So the get of the root is going to get all the values out of that map, all the to-dos, and then if there's a completed parameter, if there's not a completed parameter, it's going to filter out all the stuff that isn't completed. That's what this code is saying. So it's not really using a database to do that. Normally this might be a select or something like that, but here we're just doing a filter. This is using the Java Streams API to do a filter of that. So if you use JavaScript, like this should look pretty familiar.
Yeah.
And then we render a template and we pass in the to-dos and then whether or not we're showing the completed. And so let me go take a look at that template real quick. JTE is type safe, so you have to specify the parameters that you pass in. So we're passing in a collection of to-dos and then whether or not we're showing the completed to-dos. And then we've got some stuff up in the header. I've got HTMX loaded up, although I'm not using it yet. And then in here, I've got a form that you can use to toggle whether or not you're showing the completed to-dos. And then we've got a to-do list, which is an unordered list. And it includes another template. And that template just does a for loop over all the to-dos and does a simple little list item for each one and shows what the to-do is, like the text of it, and then offers a couple of buttons, one to delete the to-do and then one to mark it completed if it's not completed yet. And so that's just included separately. And then finally down at the bottom, there's yet another form where you can create a new to-do by posting to the to-dos URL. So this is all hooked up. This is what I would call a Web 1.0 application. There's no JavaScript being used for it. And if we come over here and take a look, you can see, sure enough, we've got a couple of to-dos. We've got this UI up here. We can add a new to-do. So example, I can hit enter and I get a new to-do. We can mark things as complete. And then I can show completed stuff and it shows them slightly different, whatever. And then you can delete things as well. And you can see that that's gone. So really simple, basic CRUD, create, read, update, and delete. There's no way to update them right now, but whatever. It's just more of the same. So that's the basic. This is a very basic to-do app. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to use HTMX to improve this UI, so let's do that. So the first thing that I wanted to do here is I wanted to make it such that, let's see, which one I want to, the first thing I want to do here is right now, when you click on delete, there's no confirmation, right? Like it just deletes it. Right. And so that thing's gone. And that's usually like a pretty bad practice. Usually what you want to do is you want to like confirm like, hey, do you want to delete that thing? So what we're going to do there is we're going to make the delete. Actually, we're going to turn this delete instead of being a form that's using here, I'll show you this real quick. Instead of using where are we? Where am I? Sorry, my screen is all screwed up because it's so small.
So good.
Where's my requests? Network filter all. Here we go. Okay. So instead of doing like a full page refresh, like we're doing here, come on, let me resize this. Okay, so instead, this is like a full like. It actually ended up doing a redirect back to the root directory, but it's doing a full request. So if I put a test to do in here, sorry, scroll down. And like when I click delete here, let me clear this real quick. When I click delete, you can see up here, it did a post. It did a post to this and then did a redirect to the root directory, which issued a get. And so it's a full, sort of like web application. So what I want to do is I want to rework that interaction to just be an inline interaction using HTMX. So let's do that real quick. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over here to the to-do list and find the delete button, which is right here. And so this is a form right now, which issues a post to delete. And you have to do that right now because Forms can't issue. There's actually, HTTP has a delete method, right? Like there is an actual delete method that's available in HTTP, but you can't use it with forms. You can actually put it in here. And I think Firefox will actually do the right thing, but most browsers won't. Safari certainly won't. I don't believe Chrome will as well. But what you really want to issue is a delete here because we're deleting this to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to, instead of having this on a form, we're going to take this button out of the form and we're just going to make it a standalone hypermedia control. And what we're going to do is we're going to say hx delete. And we're going to say, I want to delete. And now instead of having this stupid like path with the action encoded in it, which is not correct in my opinion. It's not what do I want to say? It's not as aesthetically pleasing as it should be. What we really want to do is we just want to issue a delete to the URL to do / whatever the to do ID is, right? And so hx delete is an attribute in HTMX, and there's hx get, post, put, and all the rest of it that you can use. And so this will issue an HTTP delete as an AJAX request, so now I can delete that. And what I can do is I can come over here to my app and find the delete thing. And so instead of handling it as a post, we can say delete, and we can get rid of this path. And the logic stays pretty much the same, but now we don't want to do a redirect. What I think we want to do here is I think we want to just render. How do I do this? CTX. And here I have to render. Can I render just a string? Render, 1 second. This is me showing my lack of knowledge about what can I do here? Render file path. I don't want to render. I want to, is there raw? What is there raw? And this is, I'm sorry, this is me learning the API as we go here.
Good.
Body content. I'll just dig through it. Headers. So we can set headers. That's good. We might use that in a little bit. HTML. I wonder if I can do that. Let's take a look at that. It sets the content. Perfect. Okay. So we can just say, okay, I want the response to be empty. I just want it to be empty. Okay. And so this means the HTML response is going to be empty. And then what we can do here in for this button is we can say, okay, I want you to do the following. I want you to take the content that comes back, and I want you to target, and I want the target to be the closest LI. So we're saying basically, I want you to take the response and I want you to target this this list element. And then we can additionally say, okay, I want you to swap. I want that to be the outer HTML, because I want you to take that empty response that's going to come back, and I want you to replace the entire LI with it. I don't want you to, the default in HTMX would be to take that content and put it inside the LI, but we want to take that content and just replace this whole LI with it. Okay. So that's what we're saying here. Closest, we want to target the closest LI, and we want to take whatever comes back and replace the LI replace the LI with it. And so now we've got HX delete, an HX target, and an HX swap. Now, if we wanted a different event to drive that, we could use HX trigger, and we could do something like mouse over. This is a terrible idea, but if we wanted a different event to do this, we could do it using the HX trigger attribute, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to let the natural event, which for a button is a click. Okay, so I did that. Now I'm going to restart my app. I don't need to actually here, but I just want to get those to-dos back. So let's hit refresh and we can get those to-dos back. And so now, if I cleared this, if I click on one of these guys, we'll see what happens. I'm sure I screwed this up. Delete. Oh, hey, look at that. So that row went away, right? And if I come down here, I can look, and sure enough, there was a delete that was issued to to-dos 1, and the response was empty, so there was no data that came back, and that replaced that list item, right? You replaced that list item, so it did the right thing. That's amazing. And if I hit refresh, it's still gone. Okay, so this what's kind of cool about this is like if I say to do here, I'm going to add a bunch of to dos just real quick to get some scroll state here. So, whoops, created an empty one, doesn't matter. We'll delete that one in a second. So previously, the way it was set up with a form, if you click delete, it would scroll back up to the top, right? Because you're doing a form submission, you're doing a full web page refresh. But now with HTMX, because it's issuing an AJAX request, we can be down here at the bottom and like we can click delete and just that guy disappeared. Sorry, these all look the same, so it's not super easy to see what's going on. But
Yeah.
we're not losing our scroll state. So if you watch the scroll bar over here, when I click delete, it's an AJAX request that went up to the server, and our scroll state is staying the same. So we're getting sort of the benefits of SPAs where you don't have like these big ugly page refreshes, but we're doing it in a way that's very similar to sort of like standard HTML. We're exchanging hypermedia. We're using hypermedia controls. This button is now a hypermedia control by itself, and we're issuing, what in my mind are correct delete requests to the right URL, and so it's all pretty nice in that regard. Now, the one last thing that we wanted to do here was I wanted to add a confirmation. I wanted to add a confirmation here. And so I'm going to come back here and I'm going to add an HX confirm. Are you sure you want to delete this to do? And hit refresh. And now when I delete, it's going to ask me, and this is obviously like not the best UI in the world,
But it works.
But it works. And so maybe this isn't the right thing for like your, user for your super sexy user facing internet scale thing. But on the other hand, if you're building like an internal app or, some management panel, or maybe even just like an unimportant part of that application, like maybe this is good enough. And if I click cancel, it won't delete it. Let me add one that's to do different. So there you saw, do you see how it went back up to the top? That's because I haven't used HTMX on this thing yet. So it did that full page refresh. But now, if I click delete and I say cancel, then it's not going to delete this guy. If I say okay, then it is going to delete that guy. So that's just an example, I think, of like, this is, 1, 2, 3, 4 attributes that replaced a form that looked a lot like this. So, with a button inside of it, and gives you a fair amount of functionality that lets you, do something like pretty cool, like that. I think improves this to-do application quite a bit. So that's sort of one example. Any questions or comments about that?
Yeah, so the first thing that jumps out to me is you're using Ajax, but not in the typical sense of requesting JSON, right? And because the popular truth is that when you do fetch, when you use what's it Axios, you're always getting JSON, but
Axios,
you're
yeah.
doing Ajax, but you're doing Ajax, but you're making hypermedia no calls, and that makes a lot of sense, really, of that usage. That's amazing. So because there's so much that have been lost to this whole JSON thing, because Ajax just doesn't, make a full page refresh, but you could make an asynchronous, because that's the whole thing. Asynchronous, you could do it, and not let the full page reload. You could just do it and just load that portion of the page that needs to change. That's beautiful.
Yeah, it's very symmetric with like links and forms. Like that's what I would say about HTMX is it takes those ideas and then adds this ability to like say where to put the result, how to put it somewhere, and then it gives you more access to these other, these other HTTP verbs or methods, delete and put and patch. So it's pretty cool.
Cool.
And I've got one other feature I wanted to implement that'll hopefully push HTMX a little harder. So you want me to move on to that?
Yeah,
Okay.
please, let's do it.
So let's go to the index. And what I want to do here is I want to make this form action here, like where we've got the show completed. So it's up at the top here. So you can mark something as completed. And then if you want to see it, you have to click that and submit and so forth. And so what I want to do is I want to add the ability to type things, and let's or to do like sort of a like type and search as you go thing. Okay. And we're going to do that with actually on the server side, which for, if you only got 10 to-dos, that doesn't make a ton of sense. But if you've got like a big table, if you've got enterprise-wide to-dos or whatever, you've got 1,000 to-dos and you want to search, then that's something that's, probably more efficiently done on the server. So what we're going to do is we're going to come here to this form, and we're going to sort of buff it out. So I'm going to add an input. I'm going to call it, what do I want to call it? Let's call it name equals Q, or S for search. Let's just call it search. And then type equals text, and then placeholder equals type to search. And if I refresh, now we've got this. And what I want to do is, as you type MA, like I want it to filter down and to update this. So what I can do here on this form is I can say something like this. I can say, okay, let's do an HX get equals slash. And now what I want this to trigger on is I actually want it to trigger on HX trigger. I want it to trigger on two things. I want it to trigger when you actually check the checkbox. So that's a change event, I believe. And then I also want it to trigger when you actually key up here. So like as you're typing, I want it to actually do the search. Okay. And so that's a key up event. Is it key up? I think it's key up event. And but I don't want it to hammer the server like every single time there's a key up, right? Like I don't want that to happen. So what I want to do is what you can say in HTMX in the trigger attribute is you can say delay 500 milliseconds, and that'll delay the request from occurring. And if another key up occurs, it sort of resets that timer. And so that's going to debounce effectively that's going to debounce things. And then there's another modifier that I can put in, which is changed. I'm not going to do that. We'll leave it like this for now. I won't get into that. So if I do that and I come over here, if I type M, let's see, did it do its thing? Did I do an HX? I've got an HX get, and I've got a trigger, which is key up, delay. Let me clear this, and we do M. It's not working. Hold on one second. A form. Let me get rid of this stuff. Change, delete. Okay, so that worked. But notice that we've got kind of a mess here, right? We've actually got two. First of all, we haven't implemented this. We haven't implemented the actual server side stuff, so we need to implement the actual search. But we're actually getting back like a WI here. And the problem here is that we're issuing that request and we're getting back, because right now when you issue a request to slash, the email the HTML you get back is just everything. It's just everything, right? And so what we need to do now is we need to start specializing our endpoint a little bit to understand, like, when is an HTMX request coming in? When is it not coming in? And so let's go over to our app and let's go to the root thing. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to say something like this. If CTX get, is it header? If the header HX request is present, not equal to null, then we don't want to render the entire index. What we want to render is instead just that little partial bit, just the to-do list. We just want to render this thing. We don't want to render the whole thing. And so let's add our else here and blah, blah, blah. duplicate that, move it up. And so here we want to update. We want to render the to-do list.jte, and we pass in the to-dos, but not the show completed, because that's not part of that thing. So now what we're saying is, okay, if HTMX makes a request to this URL, then we just want to render only the to-dos. I need to know in there. Sorry. Only the to-dos. But if that isn't present, then we want to render everything. So this is just like a simple little way to do that. Now let's also implement the filtering. So I think it's CTX get query param, and what did we call it? We called it the search. So if there's a search, and if string dot is empty, I forget what it is. If search does not equal null and not search is equal to empty, then what we want to do is we want to do another filter where we say, okay, filter where the to-do, which is just the string of it, contains that search. So this is going to filter down my to-dos based on that search. That's what that's doing, just very standard filter stuff, like whatever. So now we've got this ability to search and filter these things. So cool. So now I'm going to restart, just make sure everything reloads properly. And it'll be a miracle if this actually works, but we'll see. So if I hit refresh, like my to-dos are gone. Let's add make a cake and create an HTMX demo. So those are some things. And now what I should be able to do is I should be able to say make. I got it wrong. Oh, I didn't target the right thing. I didn't target the right thing. Okay, we're good. Okay. We're good. Let me go to index. So we're going to get back just this like to-do list, right? Mm-hmm. I don't have a target for this yet. So what we want to target is we want to target this UL. And as luck would have it, this UL has an ID to-do list. And so what we can say now with this is I want to HX target. And here we can use a CSS selector to say the to-do list. And so it's going to target this to-do list down here. It's going to target this element in the UI with the response. And so let me refresh. And now if I type M, sure enough, make a meme. Sure enough, it filters it down, right?
It works.
And it works. Unbelievable. And I think if I mark this complete and then it resets because we got to do a bunch more stuff. If I mark this as complete and then show completed and search. But if I do like M, it'll show, this, the whole thing will, it's like it's like doing the right thing because we've sort of turned this thing into Hypermedia control that responds to key ups and change events and so forth. And so this is an example, I think, of a pretty sophisticated user interface that has been achieved with, 3 attributes. And, admittedly, like some advanced stuff, but like it's all just HTML. And so if we look at the response that's coming back here, let me refresh this and turn this off. So we've got our to-dos, and if I want to filter on make, I can type M. Let me clear my responses. So I type M, and it issues that request, and you can see the response is just the internal LI. It's just that little snippet of HTML, right? It's just that snippet of HTML. It's not a full page. You're not, you're just responding with just the stuff I want to put into this list. And so that's a good example, I think, of fairly sophisticated user interface. Admittedly, not the best styling in the world. I'm just using Pico CSS and a couple of simple CSS directives. But it's the idea is there, right? The idea is there that you've got this ability to use HTMX to improve on this UI. It's interacting with the server using HTML, and we're making what is a sort of a clunky old school web application much more dynamic, but within that original model, within that hypermedia model of the web. So that's the demo. Any questions or comments on it? Does it make sense?
Yeah, it does make a lot of sense, and I love the fact that you're using headers. I feel it's gonna be very much more involved in terms of, like, because the server got to be the one to like drive, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, you're gonna send this HTML, you're gonna check
Yep.
if it's an HTMX request. So it's definitely gonna be involved, and
Yep.
that's
Yeah.
fine. That
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah, and the really nice thing about this pattern that I've got here is if the user disables, and I should go back. Let me go back here to
Mm-hmm.
index, and if we kept the original action equals slash and method equals get, if we kept these attributes, whoops, sorry, if we kept these attributes on here, what's really nice about this is that if the user has JavaScript disabled, then this action and method will continue to work. And so they will be
Mm-hmm.
able to, like, they won't get this really nice, like, as you type functionality, but if they type make and JavaScript is
Mm-hmm.
disabled, they can still click submit and like have that search functionality. It's just going to
Mm.
take, it'll just take this branch. It'll just take the else branch. It'll still do the search. It'll still include the parameters, like all the normal stuff. It'll just take this
Yeah.
branch and render the whole page. And so they'll get a full page refresh, which obviously isn't as nice as this, like, as you type behavior that you have here, but you still have that. It's progressively enhanced. So we progressively
Yeah.
enhance the application so that the people who have JavaScript disabled, or if JavaScript's not working for whatever reason, the application will continue to work. So that's another thing. HTMX doesn't like automatically make that happen. There's another library called Unpoly, which I would highly recommend everyone take a look at, which does a really good job of emphasizing progressive enhancement. But it is possible to do in HTMX if you set things up right. And that's kind of a theme in HTMX, which is like, it just gives you these tools. And if you use them a certain way, then great. If you don't, then also great. But you're going to have to maybe do some work to make certain things
Yeah.
work the way you want.
Mm.
So,
Yeah. Do some work to make certain things work. I like it.
yep.
Yeah, but this is fun. Like I like the fact that it's agnostic. You just drop it, and if you're a server side heavy person before, it's a walk in the park.
Yep.
And even if you're not, you could just learn how to do that. To send back the
Yeah.
chunks. The HTML. It makes a lot of
Yep.
sense. So, what sort of applications have you seen? Because I know API Toolkit use it. So, what sort of
Yeah.
applications have you seen like using HTMX 100%?
Web ring. Let's see here. This is
WebRing.
my web ring.
Okay.
So column space, Zorro management. This one's pretty fancy. Contexte. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you can dig through, like Nike Vision uses it for their search functionality. TurboScribe's
Mm-hmm.
like an AI transcription thing. So used a lot. I think HTMX makes sense when, so first of all, Zorro management, if you go and look at it, like this is crazy. Like the user interface here, the person who's working on this, he's actually a core member on the HTMX dev team.
Okay.
And he has pushed HTMX like way beyond what I would have thought you could do with it. And he's written a lot of JavaScript. So the JavaScript and the HTMX interact with one another via events, and
Mm-hmm.
he's a very good programmer. He's a game programmer, so he knows what he's doing, and he's
Yeah.
not afraid of anything. And so he's done a really good job of building a very sophisticated user interface with HTMX doing the synchronization with the server, but then JavaScript really enhancing the user experience. So I would encourage people to take a look at that for just like, this is what's
Mm-hmm.
possible, although most people probably wouldn't want to use HTMX for it. But stuff like TurboScribe, like this is something, it uses AI to do things, and the user interface needs are pretty simple, whereas the server side is obviously very sophisticated. Like the server side does like all sorts of sound processing and blah blah blah, and but the user interface for it is text, and sort of like it's telling you what's going on, and it just doesn't need to be as sophisticated as something like what we were just looking at, sorry, I'm blanking on the name. Hold on, I lost my.
Yeah,
It
sure.
doesn't need to be. Yeah, it doesn't need to be
Zoro.
sophisticated as Zoro management. Sorry.
Yeah.
And so this is an example where if you're adding a ton of value on the server side, then maybe HTMX lets you simplify the client side so that you're not sinking time and effort into maintaining a complicated client side, and instead you can focus on where your value add, which is maybe on the server. So those are just a couple of examples. I think like the more sort of web cruddy, your application is, the better HTMX is going to be for it, and the further you get away from that, the less ideal it is for it. So not perfect for everything, but I think a lot of apps could definitely be written in it and benefit from it.
Yeah, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. I love seeing, like I said, we are all neighbors on the web, and I love
Yeah.
seeing how every one of us build. It's just interesting. Yeah, so
Nice.
thank you. Yeah, really. Yeah, it is. It is very interesting, like to see these different ways of doing stuff. And I love, I'm gonna go dive into the source code of HTMX because I think it'll be
Mm,
fairly easy to read because I'm really interested in
yeah.
a lot of stuff, the directives, your Ajax requests and all that
Yeah.
stuff. So thank you so
I
much,
did
Carson.
I I
Yeah,
did
go
a
on.
deep dive. I did a deep dive video on the implementation of HTMX. If you go to
Oh,
htmx.org/essays, there's a video at the bottom, which is like, I
mm-hmm.
think it's called a deep dive, and I just go through and talk about how it works. I think it's 3,000 lines of code, and it's a single file, and it's written in a somewhat idiosyncratic style, but it's not hard to understand.
Okay.
It's very easy to
Yeah.
debug. That's one thing I like about it, is like you can set breakpoints and like see what's going on pretty easily. So
Yeah. And I am pretty sure you're not using TypeScript, right?
I'm not. I just use vanilla
Th-
JavaScript. No build.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is fun.